it's odd that magic and Crowley and Thelema are still popularly viewed as very dark. Now, yes, we do look very heavily at the dark side because that's where all the power is, that's where all the deeper understanding is, that's where all the disowned bits of us are. We are something very energized deep down. We are something powerful. There's nothing wrong with power. There's nothing wrong with personal power. The power becomes wrong when you violate this do what thou wilt principle and tromp on top of somebody else's will. Crowley, in a number of places, emphasizes that the star in its correct orbit almost never collides with anything else. There's plenty of space around it. If you are actually following your own path, following your own true will, living your own dharma, yeah, you'll have friction with people, you'll have the occasional argument, dispute, discomfort, relationship breakup as anyone else does, but you don't necessarily need to bang heads with anybody. You can realize that which you are and find that as in his phrase, Crowley's phrase, the inertia of the universe is behind you. The universe is backing you up in your individuality because you're expressing something that's fundamental within you. This isn't New Age wishy-washy where you're trying to be light-filled and you're trying to be nice to everybody. It's not about being nice. I'm not a nice person. I'm quite nasty. But you are allowing all that's in there a means of expression. You may have to adjust the means of expression if there's a lot of rage. Maybe artistic work would be a more constructive way of doing it, putting paint on a canvas than looking for fights with your family or spraying it on a wall. But it needs to come out, it needs to be accepted as part of what you are, and it needs to be fulfilled and seen as fitting into the total constellation of your own being. Go through further and further and further, you're going to find at the core of all of that rage, anxiety, insecurity, whatever it is that's going on with you that you don't like, is in fact an emptiness that is not a void in the usual sense. It's a silence, but not an absence of content or meaning. There is a darkness, yet it is not a darkness devoid of love and meaning. I could keep on throwing out metaphors, but there is at the core of things something that is absolutely still and seems to be absolutely right for what you are.
Would it be maybe a good allusion would be like a fertile womb ready to create form?
You could certainly work with that, yeah. We all find different metaphors as we go through. Yes, simply put, yes.
It's got all the potentials in there, and yet it hasn't expressed itself.
Yet you find out of this nothingness comes this remarkable creative urge, the here, the true will, this dynamic, I want to exist thing is coming out of nothing.
Yeah. I remember there was another allusion I read it, and it was an early belief system about the goddess Kali, because in Indian legend she's supposed to be the ultimate destroyer of time and space, like she's the shatterer of illusions. And what she says, what a good way to picture the Kali nature is like a cauldron, full of water and a fire, and what bubbles in the cauldron are all the worlds of form, and she's the water around it that creates the bubbles that come up and then disappear and come up and disappear. So
I would reply to that, if that works for you, follow it through and really explore what that means to you. I'm not trying to dismiss what you're about. I never personally had a strong resonance with the Hindu gods. I just happened to be into the Egyptian ones, which was another reason I glommed onto Thelema, even though its core deities are not really Egyptian, we say they're Egyptiform. So I work with that set of metaphors, that set of poetic symbols. But if you're finding the Hindu stuff works for you, then yes, follow that through. I like the image of it. I think it's a cool one.
But I was listening to you speak, and I was wondering, like you know, in this upward movement of the consciousness from the nefesh to the, what is it, the Osiran consciousness, where you're starting to get out of the nefesh, but you haven't quite reached the neshama. And I was wondering if it's sort of like the same with the resistance within ourselves and in the greater society might be the idea that that in moving from what we are now into the top 3 spots on the Kabbalic tree could be that, like in Buddhism, they say the individual's like a drop of water, and nirvana is like the drop of water joining the ocean. And maybe the fear is that when we lose our status as that drop of water and we join the ocean, we lose the drop of water status. We lose what we have as the drop of water. And we become nothingness, when in fact what happens, what probably would happen is that we still keep our own molecular identity, but we become tied to all the different all the other different molecular identities in the ocean, but we don't lose our own. But because people think we do, they want to hang on to just being the drop because they're so terrified of becoming a nothing.
Absolutely, yeah. No, we are very terrified of losing ego identity.
Yeah.
But I think you're absolutely right. What you call the molecular identity remains.
Yeah.
I had this discussion with somebody yesterday about the idea that in any spiritual path you're trying to dissolve the ego. No, you're not. In fact, I don't believe it is possible to be an incarnate human, however much time you spent in the cave meditating, and lose the ego. What happens is that the ego begins to lose its prominence there because it's not as necessary. The ego is your interface with the world. It's what you've constructed here to deal with the various things that, as you were growing up, seem to be threats, dangers, difficult problems. Now, as you're going through all of these spiritual processes, if it's all working more or less okay, there is a constantly expanding inner awareness. The ego becomes less necessary. So that somebody who is, as we say, enlightened, basically is still using an ego, but doesn't have that basic anxiety that says, I need the ego there for protection. You've lost the sense that you are separate from the world. You've lost the sense that you are at odds with the world. I had a quote here that I got from...
So the ego becomes a tool in the toolbox rather than your identity.
There's a quote here from Daniel Pinchbeck. He's a social critic and author, who used the phrase a psychic blockade. The psychic blockade is reinforced by a vast propaganda machine spewing out crude as well as sophisticated distractions, encouraging individuals to see themselves as alienated spectators of their culture, rather than active participants in a planetary ecology. I hadn't come across that before. Maybe some of you know that one. But that's where you're going. You're beginning to embrace more and more and more stuff as you go through, and realizing that it's way less dangerous than it seemed to be. My mother was a woman who was ruled by terrible neurotic fear of the world. I scared her so much as a kid because I was interested in ancient history and astronomy, and these things, it filled her with an existential dread. No, all that stuff's weird and I don't understand it. She didn't understand it and she felt it was a threat to me. I've often thought that my moving to live in central Mexico, and I live in a very small village in the mountains, would be the ultimate terror for her. Some people speak a bit of English. That's the first thing. They don't speak English. They don't have English middle class values. They aren't, well, they don't even have a shower or a bath every day. Quite a few of them definitely don't. It was kind of a dare with myself. Can I do this? Can I actually go so far out of my physical safety zone and see what's there? And I found that, in fact, it's rather disappointing. Like, you look at it and think, yeah, I can go outside of my physical safety zone. I need food, water, and a roof over my head. And considering how quickly I ran out of money when I was building this tiny little house, yeah, I've got food, water, and a roof over my head. Don't come visit me and ask where the sofa is, because it doesn't exist. But it doesn't matter. You can manage without a lot of things. But the idea of transgressing is very important. You need to transgress your own sense of limits. Where I found the challenge came was not the physical thing, but the actual sense of these people, while they've been, this village has been there for 3,000 years, and it's quite probable that some of the people there, maybe the majority, are direct lineal descendants of the people whose bits of pottery you dig up from time to time from 3 millennia ago. That doesn't make them interesting. If you live in a small village, you can be an incredibly boring person. You might even be doing, rituals up in the mountains. I've been occasionally with people who do rituals in the mountains. They're not necessarily interesting people. That was where I had to realize I had to make my own life interesting, or else I was going to get bored stupid. That was the difficult thing. Keeping something creative happening in your own life is way more difficult than maintaining the physical environment. Unless you're really bad at maintaining a physical environment. In which case, of course, life is a disaster to begin with, so forget about it.
So in Hinduism, they talk about how we're in the age of Kali Yuga, and in Thelema, it's like the Aeon of Horus. Do they at all correlate, or?
Not even remotely.
No. What do you think of that? Because they say it's kind of apocalyptic, because they're talking about how we're going more, as society progresses, it's becoming more material and spiritual. Yet, with that tradition of going, you started ISIS, into more masculine deities. They also talk about the approach, from the maternal deities, I guess, towards the more masculine in this age, which is supposed to last 10,000 years. That's the only similarity I noticed.
My view of the idea of a Kali Yuga is rather that it's an Osirian aeon parallel to the Christian notion that we are always coming up to the end times and judgment. That things are terribly bad, and we have to be scared. If you're in the age of the Ruach, the self-consciousness, and there's this awareness that there is some big spiritual possibility, some big spiritual consciousness there, it doesn't make you feel good.
No.
It's scary as all hell. It's absolutely terrifying. This thing is unknown. It's way bigger than your ego self and your intellectual structures and your ideas about things. And all of the stuff you've been debating with your friends since you were in high school doesn't mean anything. It's irrelevant. Reason is a lie, and all their words are skew-wise, as the book of the law says. You develop this dreadful paranoia. And of course, in that Osirian age, there was this disownership of the nefesh stuff, the instincts, because that was a threat as well. So you're getting it from both ends. On the one hand, your animal nature might betray you and you'll go to hell. And on the other hand, this thing up there, because it seems to be up there, that's how our minds portray this stuff, is going to be the thing that sends me to hell. I'm doomed! And of course, you get stuck in that psychology. Thelema came in and said, hey, you know what? Everything you are is absolutely okay. Or to quote the book of the law, these vices are my service. Really?